The silence of a Seattle dawn is not a peaceful one. It is heavy, damp, and smells of old cedar and unsaid regrets. At 5 in the morning, the fog clings to the Victorian windows of my home on Queen Anne Hill like a shroud. I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, my fingers traced the rim of a cold porcelain cup. My late husband, Julian, always said this house breathed with us. But today, the air felt thin, as if the oxygen was being slowly bled out by the two people sleeping in the guest room upstairs. My son, Thomas, my boy. How does a mother reconcile the man he is now with the child who used to hide his face in the crook of my neck when the lightning flashed over the sound? He was my heart's anchor after Julian died. For years it was just us against the world, two survivors in a house too big for its echoes. But then came Sienna. Sienna with her sharp smiles and eyes like polished flint. She didn't just enter our lives, she colonized them. The floorboards groaned overhead. It was a subtle sound, a rhythmic vibration that traveled down the walls and settled in my marrow. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, bird-like thrumming. I should have felt safe. This was my sanctuary. I bought this house with 30 years of quiet labor at the public library, cataloguing the stories of others while building my own. Every book on the shelves, every rug on the hardwood, was a testament to a life lived with dignity. But dignity is a fragile thing when faced with the cold hunger of a predator. The kitchen door creaked. I didn't turn around. I knew the scent of her perfume, something expensive and metallic, like blood hidden under roses. Still awake, Martha? Or just waiting for the inevitable? Sienna's voice was a low rasp, cutting through the morning mist. I kept my gaze fixed on the grey light bleeding through the window. It's my house, Sienna. I'm allowed to sit in it. For now, she replied. I heard the click of her heels on the tile, sharp, predatory staccatos. She stopped right behind me. I could feel her breath on my ear, cold and mocking. Thomas is tired, Martha. He's tired of the stairs, tired of the maintenance, and quite frankly, he's tired of the burden of checking if you've fallen every morning. We found a lovely place in Bellevue, a facility, professional, quiet, just like you. I am not going to a facility, I whispered, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. I'm 68, not invalid. My mind is as sharp as yours. Is it? She leaned over, placing a thick stack of papers on the marble counter. I caught a glimpse of the bold heading, Irrevocable Power of Attorney. Then you should be smart enough to sign these. Thomas already has. He wants this to be over. He wants his life back. The betrayal was a dull ache at first, then a searing heat. Thomas, my Thomas. Had he really signed his mother away? Had he stood by while she planned my erasure? I looked at the papers, and for a moment, the world tilted. The ink seemed to swirl like black smoke. I won't sign them, Sienna. Go back upstairs. There was a long, suffocating pause. I expected her to argue, to hiss more insults, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. Then it happened. Her hand clamped onto my shoulder, her nails digging through my nightgown and into my skin. She spun my chair around with a strength that belied her slender frame. Before I could even gasp, the world exploded into a flash of white light and a stinging, ringing roar. The slap didn't just hurt, it deafened me. My head snapped to the side, and I felt the metallic tang of blood as my tooth sliced into the inside of my cheek. I stared at the floor, at the intricate patterns of the rug I had chosen with Julian 30 years ago. A single drop of crimson fell onto the fabric, a dark stain on a cherished memory. Listen to me, you old ghost, Sienna hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifying, suppressed rage. She leaned down, her face inches from mine. I could see the pores of her skin, the utter lack of empathy in her dilated pupils. Thomas is sleeping. He's exhausted from fixing the messes you leave behind. If you wake him, if you say a word about this, I will make sure your last few years are a living hell. Sign the papers by tonight, or I'll find a way to make the state declare you a danger to yourself. And believe me, I'm much better at telling stories than you ever were. She stood up, smoothing her silk robe as if she hadn't just shattered a human soul. I'm going back to bed. Think about it while you clean up that mess on your lip. And remember, no one hears you, Martha, not even your son. She walked out, the sound of her footsteps fading as she ascended the stairs. I sat there, frozen. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of a crime scene. I touched my cheek. It was hot, pulsing with a life of its own. My hand trembled, not with fear, but with a cold, crystalline realization. I looked up at the ceiling. Somewhere up there, my son was dreaming, oblivious, or worse, complicit. Was he the little boy who used to bring me dandelions? Or was he the man who let a stranger strike his mother in the dark? Why didn't I scream? The question echoed in the hollow spaces of my mind. Why did I stay silent? Because a mother's instinct is to protect, even when she is the one who needs protection. I protected Thomas from the truth of what he had married. I protected the image of the family I had spent decades building. But that image was dead now. It died with the sound of Sienna's palm meeting my face. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting. Every movement felt like wading through deep water. I walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face. The reflection in the mirror was a stranger. My eyes were sunken, my skin sallow, and the right side of my face was already beginning to bloom into a dark, angry purple. I didn't cry. The time for tears had passed with the morning fog. Instead, I opened the cupboard and reached for the heavy iron skillet. They wanted a meal. They wanted a celebration of their victory. I would give it to them. I began to chop. The knife hit the wooden board with a satisfying rhythmic thud. Thump, thump, thump. I thought about the secondary bank account Julian had set up for me years ago, the one Thomas didn't know about. I thought about Arthur, Julian's old partner, who still worked at the firm downtown. They thought I was an old woman who had lost her place in the world. They thought because I was quiet, I was empty. But a library is only quiet because it holds too much power within its covers. I am Martha Thorne. I have read every book on human nature, every tragedy, every triumph. I know how stories end. Sienna wants this house. She wants my silence. I looked at the browning bruise in the mirror and allowed myself a single cold smile. Tonight, Sienna, I whispered to the empty kitchen. Tonight you will learn exactly what I have been cooking. The sun began to rise over the Cascades, a thin line of gold cutting through the grey. But for me, the darkness was just beginning to feel like home. I reached for my phone, my fingers steady now. It was time to call an old friend. It was time to invite the guests to a dinner they would never forget. The first step was the hardest, admitting that the son I loved was a shadow, and the woman he brought home was a monster. But once you accept the monster is in the house, you stop trying to hide. You start setting the trap. I reached for the flour, the white dust coating my hands like ash. Respect. Retribution. The ingredients were all here. I just needed to wait for the family to wake up. I needed to act the part for a few more hours. The bruise throbbed. I welcomed it. It was the only thing that felt real in this house of lies. Thomas, I murmured, looking toward the stairs. I hope you're hungry. The bruise on my cheek felt like a living thing, a dark, pulsing nebula that had claimed half of my face as its territory. Every time I breathed, the skin stretched, sending a sharp electric reminder of Sienna's palm directly to my brain. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, haunting my own life, my hands performing the muscle memory tasks of 40 years, while my mind was miles away, buried in a time when the air in this house didn't taste like copper and betrayal. I reached for the flour bin, the wood smooth under my fingertips, wood Julian had sanded himself one summer when Thomas was just a toddler. Everything in this house had a story, a heartbeat, a memory attached to it. And now those memories were being used as weapons against me. I remember Thomas at 7 years old. He had fallen off his bike on the sidewalk just outside, scraping his knee so badly that the white of the bone seemed to peek through the grit and blood. I had carried him inside, his small, sobbing frame shaking against mine. "It's okay, Tommy," I had whispered, pressing my face into his hair, which smelled of sunshine and grass. "Mommy's here. I'll never let anything hurt you." I had spent that entire afternoon sitting on the edge of his bed, reading him stories about brave knights and distant lands until he fell asleep, his hand gripping my thumb as if it were his only connection to a safe harbor. Where was that boy now? How could the child who once feared a scraped knee stand by while his wife carved out my soul with a smile? The stairs groaned again. This time the footsteps were heavier, more hesitant. Thomas. I didn't turn around when he entered the kitchen. I couldn't. I was afraid that if I looked at him, he would see the ghost of the mother who used to bake him birthday cakes in the ruins of the woman he was now helping to destroy. I heard the scrape of a chair, his chair, the one at the head of the table where Julian used to sit. The audacity of it felt like another slap. "Morning, Mum," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth that used to define our conversations. It was the voice of a man who had already checked out, a man who had traded his conscience for the comfort of a quiet life dictated by a predator. "Good morning, Thomas," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. I kept my face turned toward the stove, adjusting the flame under the kettle. I had applied a thick layer of concealer over the bruise, a mask of vanity and survival. I wondered if he would notice. I wondered if he even cared to look. "Sienna said you two had a talk this morning," he continued, the sound of his fingers drumming on the table, echoing the frantic beat of my heart. "About the Bellevue place. She says you're starting to see the logic in it, that the stairs are getting to be too much for you." The logic? Is that what they called it? The systematic erasure of a human being's autonomy. I finally turned, holding 2 plates of toast. I made sure to stand in the shadows, away from the direct light of the window. "Is that what she told you, Thomas? That I'm seeing the logic?" He finally looked at me, but his eyes slid away almost instantly, focusing on a loose thread on his sleeve. He couldn't meet my gaze. "She's just worried, Mum. We both are. You're 68. This house is a labyrinth. What if you fall and we aren't here? What if you leave the stove on?" "I've lived in this house for 42 years, Thomas. I haven't burned it down yet," I said, placing the toast in front of him. "And as for falling, the only thing making me stumble lately is the weight of the lies being told in this kitchen." He stiffened, his jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of Julian. But Julian's stubbornness was born of integrity. Thomas's was born of cowardice. "Don't be like that. We're trying to help." Sienna spent all night researching the best facilities. She's doing all the heavy lifting, Martha. The least you could do is show some gratitude. Gratitude. The word tasted like ash. I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for a trace of the boy who used to bring me dandelions. I saw only a stranger wearing my son's face, a man who had been hollowed out and filled with Sienna's poison. She had whispered in his ear until my love looked like a burden and her greed looked like protection. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, a slow-motion heist of a man's morality. "Help," I whispered. Is that what the slap was? Help? The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas froze, his hand hovering over his coffee cup. He didn't look up. He didn't ask what I meant. He just sat there, the air between us thick with the unspoken. Did he know? Had she told him she hit me? Or had he heard the crack of it from the hallway and chosen to pull the covers over his head? I didn't know which was worse, his ignorance or his complicity. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally said, his voice trembling slightly. He shoved a piece of toast into his mouth, chewing mechanically. "Sienna loves you. She's family now." Family. The word was a mockery. Sienna appeared in the doorway then, as if summoned by the mention of her name. She had changed into a crisp white blouse and a pencil skirt, the image of professional grace. She looked radiant, refreshed, as if the act of assaulting an elderly woman had been a tonic for her soul. She walked over to Thomas and placed a hand on his shoulder, her fingers trailing near his neck in a gesture that was both affectionate and possessive. "Good morning, my loves," she chirped, her eyes flitting to mine for a fraction of a second. She saw the makeup. She saw the way I held my head. Her smile widened just a fraction. "Thomas, did you tell your mother about the appointment this afternoon? The realtor is coming by to do a preliminary walkthrough. We need to know what the market value is before we settle on the Bellevue deposit." Thomas looked at her, his expression shifting from guilt to a forced, desperate adoration. "I was just getting to that." "A realtor," I said, my voice as cold as the Seattle mist outside. "In my house, without my consent." Sienna leaned over the table, her scent, that metallic, bloody rose, filling my lungs. "Martha, we've been over this. Thomas has the signature authority now. We're just expediting the process. It's for everyone's peace of mind." She reached out, her hand moving toward my face as if to brush away a stray hair. I flinched, the movement violent and instinctive. Thomas looked up, a flash of confusion crossing his face. "Mum, what's wrong?" Sienna's hand stayed in mid-air for a second, a silent challenge. "Oh, she's just a bit jumpy this morning, aren't you, Martha? Probably the lack of sleep. Elderly nerves can be so fragile." She patted my hand instead, her touch feeling like a burn. "Why don't you go upstairs and rest? I'll handle the kitchen. I'll make sure everything is perfect for our guests tonight." Guests. The way she said it made my skin crawl. She thought she was in control. She thought she was the director of this play, and I was merely a prop to be moved or discarded. She didn't know about the call I had made to Arthur Sterling. She didn't know about the files Julian had left in the safe deposit box, the ones that detailed the true ownership of this property, a trust that Thomas couldn't touch without my explicit, notarized consent. Sienna was smart, but she was arrogant, and arrogance is the blind spot where shadows grow. "I'll stay," I said, pulling my hand away. "I'm making a special dinner tonight, a family tradition. I wouldn't want to miss it." Sienna laughed, a high, tinkling sound that didn't reach her eyes. "A tradition? How quaint. Just don't overexert yourself, Martha. We wouldn't want you having another episode." An episode. That was their favorite word lately. Every time I disagreed, every time I remembered something they wanted me to forget, it was an episode. They were building a case against my sanity, brick by brick, lie by lie. I looked at Thomas, hoping for a spark of recognition, a sign that he saw the trap being laid for both of us. But he was already looking back at his phone, his thumb scrolling through a world where I didn't exist. The ignominy of it was a heavy cloak, to be treated like a ghost in your own hallways, to have your son look through you as if you were already gone. I remembered when Julian and I first moved in. Thomas was 3, and he had spent the whole day running from room to room, shouting, "This is our castle! This is our castle!" Julian had laughed and swung him up onto his shoulders. "It sure is, champ, and we're going to protect it forever." Forever is a long time when you're young. Now forever felt like it was being measured in hours. I left them in the kitchen, their whispered conversations following me like hissed secrets. I retreated to my study, the room where I had spent 30 years surrounded by the wisdom of others. I sat at my desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a small, leather-bound ledger. Julian's ledger. Inside were the details of the Sterling Trust. Sienna thought she had Thomas's signature, but she didn't realize that in this house, Julian's word was still law. I looked at the phone. Arthur would be here at 7. He had been Julian's best friend, a man who valued loyalty above all else. He knew the truth about Sienna. He had been the one to warn me months ago, but I hadn't wanted to believe him. I hadn't wanted to believe that my son could be so easily led astray. The tragedy of a library, Julian used to say, is that people only see the spines, never the secrets hidden between the pages. Sienna saw a spine, an old, fragile woman who could be broken. She hadn't bothered to read the story inside. She didn't know that a librarian spends her life organizing information, connecting dots, and waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. I touched the bruise again. The pain was steady now, a rhythmic throb that kept me anchored in the present. I wouldn't let the memories drown me. I would use them. Every dandelion Thomas brought me, every story I read him, every sacrifice I made to ensure he had a future. I would hold them all in my mind as I prepared the table. They wanted my house. They wanted my silence. They wanted to bury me in a quiet room in Bellevue, where I would fade away like an old photograph. But a Victorian house doesn't just breathe, it remembers. And tonight, the walls would speak. I heard the front door open, the realtor. I heard Sienna's voice, smooth and charming, explaining the unique features of the property. I heard her feet on the hardwood, the same hardwood Julian had polished until it shone like a dark mirror. Every step she took felt like a violation. I stood up and smoothed my apron. I had work to do. The iron skillet was waiting. The ingredients for the special dish were laid out. Respect, retribution, and a secret that had been aging in the cellar for a long, long time. "Thomas," I whispered, looking at a framed photo of him as a graduate. "I'm so sorry you didn't listen to the stories I told you. You might have learned how the hero always finds his way home, even if he has to burn the castle down to do it." I walked out of the study, the bruise on my face hidden by the shadows, but the fire in my heart lighting the way. The humiliation was over. The game had begun. The afternoon in Seattle brought a relentless, needle-like rain that turned the view of the Sound into a blurred expanse of slate and iron. I watched from the upstairs window as the realtor, a man with a sharp suit and an even sharper smile, climbed into his silver sedan and drove away. He had walked through my house like a coroner examining a body, noting the dated crown molding and the inefficient layout of a kitchen where I had spent half a century creating life. To him, this wasn't a castle. It was a series of checkboxes on a commission sheet, and Sienna had been his tour guide, her voice trilling through the hallways, selling my soul room by room while I stood in the shadows of the landing, a ghost waiting for the funeral to end. Martha, are you still up there brooding, or did you fall asleep in the dust? Sienna's voice drifted up the stairs, laced with that new, jagged edge she didn't bother to hide anymore. I didn't answer. I didn't have the strength to give her the satisfaction of my voice. I stayed in the dim light of the hallway, my hand resting on the banister. Julian had carved the pineapples into the newel posts, symbols of hospitality, he had said. Now they felt like stone gargoyles mocking my hospitality to the wolves. I made my way down the stairs, each step a calculated effort to remain upright. The bruise was no longer just a physical mark. It had become a lens through which I saw the world. It throbbed in time with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a rhythmic reminder that the hours were bleeding away. When I reached the kitchen, the air was heavy with the smell of the lunch Sienna had prepared for Thomas. Something light, something modern, something that left no crumbs and required no heart. Thomas was sitting at the table, his eyes glued to his laptop. He didn't look up when I entered. He had perfected a type of selective blindness that allowed him to exist in the same room as my bruised face without having to acknowledge the stain on his character. The realtor thinks we can get 1.5. Easy, he said to the screen, his voice tinged with a desperate artificial excitement. In this market with the view, we could move to Bellevue next month, Sienna. The condo has a gym, a concierge, no more worrying about old pipes or drafts. It sounds like a dream, honey, Sienna purred. She was standing at the counter, peeling an apple with a paring knife. The blade was thin, silver, and efficient. She didn't look at me either, but she moved with a performative grace, as if she were the leading lady, and I was a stagehand who had accidentally stumbled into the frame. And Martha will love the garden in the courtyard. They have benches specifically designed for senior comfort. I am not a piece of furniture to be moved for comfort, I said, the words dry and brittle as autumn leaves. Thomas winced, his fingers pausing over the keys for a split second, but he didn't look at me. Mum, please, let's not do this again. We're doing this for you. You don't see how much you're struggling. You're living in a museum of a dead man's life, and it's dragging you under. A dead man's life. Julian. The silence that followed was so thick I could almost feel it coating my lungs like soot. I walked to the counter to pour a glass of water, my hand trembling just enough to make the glass chime against the marble. Sienna didn't move. She watched me out of the corner of her eye, the paring knife stilled against the white flesh of the apple. Is that what you think, Thomas? I asked, finally finding his eyes. They were hollow, filled with a shallow guilt that had no intention of turning into action. That your father's life was a museum. This house is the only thing that remembers who you were before you became this shadow. That's enough, Martha, Sienna snapped, the knife clicking as she set it down. She turned to me, her eyes flashing with a cold, reptilian light. Thomas doesn't need to hear your nostalgic guilt trips. He's building a future. You're just clinging to a past that's rotting in the walls. Now, be a good girl and go sit in the living room. We have more paperwork to organize, and your presence is distracting. Distracting. My existence was a distraction from their convenience. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply turned and walked into the living room, the darkness of the Victorian interior wrapping around me like a cold blanket. I sat in my wingback chair and let the silence swallow me. This was the abyss. This was the moment in every tragedy where the hero realizes that the people they love are the ones holding the shovel. I looked at the bookshelves, thousands of volumes. I had spent my life as a custodian of stories, and yet I had failed to see the plot twist in my own. I had ignored the red flags, the way Sienna slowly isolated Thomas from his old friends, the way she took over the finances, the way she looked at this house not as a home, but as an asset to be liquidated. I had been a librarian who forgot to read the fine print. But as the afternoon shadows stretched across the floor, the despair began to harden into something else. It was a cold, crystalline anger, the kind that doesn't burn, but freezes. I remembered the Sterling Trust. Julian and Arthur had set it up 30 years ago, a legal fortress designed to protect me if Julian ever left me behind. It was a complex web of clauses and conditions, a masterpiece of legal architecture that Sienna, for all her sharp-eyed greed, hadn't even discovered yet. She thought Thomas's signature on a power of attorney was the key. She didn't realize the key was buried in a vault she couldn't even name. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and felt the small brass key to Julian's desk. It felt heavy, a piece of solid truth in a house built on vapor. The hours crawled by in a blur of grey rain and muffled whispers from the kitchen. Thomas and Sienna were planning their new life, where the furniture would go, which country club they would join, how they would spend the equity of my blood and tears. They talked about me in the third person, as if I were already a memory, a minor inconvenience to be managed. At 5 o'clock, the rain stopped, leaving the hill shrouded in a thick, suffocating fog. I stood up. The abyss was behind me. The silence was no longer a cage. It was a cloak. I walked into the kitchen. Sienna was tidying up, her movements sharp and efficient. Thomas was gone, likely retreated to the guest room to avoid the sight of me. "I'm going to start dinner now," I said. My voice was different, lower, steadier. Sienna didn't look up from the sink. "Don't bother, Martha. We'll just order something. You look like you're about to collapse anyway." "No," I insisted, and this time the steel in my voice made her turn. "It's a special dish. For Thomas. A family recipe he's always loved. It takes time, and I want everything to be perfect." She studied me for a long moment, the paring knife back in her hand. She saw the bruise, now a deep, ugly plum color. She saw the concealer I had tried to use, and she saw the defiance beneath it. She smiled, that thin, cruel line that passed for an emotion. "Fine. Cook your little heart out, Martha. If it keeps you busy and out of our hair, I don't care. Just try not to set the place on fire." I didn't answer. I reached for the heavy iron skillet. The preparation was a ritual. I didn't just chop vegetables. I dissected the lies they had told me. I didn't just sear meat. I burned away the remnants of my own hesitation. I reached for the vintage bottle of wine Julian had kept in the cellar, a 1985 Bordeaux he had saved for a truly monumental occasion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the house began to fill with the aroma of slow-cooked beef, red wine, and rosemary. It was the scent of memory, of a time when this house was full of laughter and light. But beneath the surface, there was something else. A bitterness. A secret. I set the table. 3 places. The fine china, the silver that Julian had polished until his hands were black with soot, the crystal glasses that caught the low light of the chandelier. I moved with a precision that would have surprised Sienna. I wasn't an old woman lost in a museum. I was a librarian organizing the final chapter. At 6:30, the doorbell rang. I heard Sienna's footsteps in the hallway. "Who could that be? Thomas, are you expecting someone?" I didn't wait for her to reach the door. I walked out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on my apron. The fire in the hearth was roaring now, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. I invited a guest, I said, my voice cutting through Sienna's confusion. She stopped, her hand on the doorknob. You what? Martha, we told you no visitors today. We have a lot of work to do. It's Julian's old friend, I said, and the name hung in the air like a threat. Arthur Sterling. The door opened. Arthur stood there, tall and imposing in a charcoal wool coat, his hair a shock of white against the Seattle night. He didn't look like a man coming for dinner. He looked like a man coming for a reckoning. His eyes immediately found mine, and then they drifted to the bruise on my cheek. I saw his jaw tighten, a flash of white-hot anger crossing his weathered face. Martha, he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Hello, Arthur. Thank you for coming. Dinner is almost ready. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning dread. Arthur, what are you doing here? I'm here to discuss the Sterling Trust, Thomas, Arthur said, stepping into the foyer and closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place was final. It was the sound of the abyss closing. Sienna looked from Arthur to me, her sharp eyes darting back and forth as she tried to calculate the shift in the room. She felt it, the sudden drop in temperature, the way the house seemed to narrow its focus. She wasn't the leading lady anymore. She was a trespasser in a story that was far older and far more powerful than her greed. The Sterling Trust, she echoed, her voice lacking its usual edge. Thomas, you didn't mention a trust. That's because Thomas doesn't know the full details, I said, stepping into the center of the foyer. I was no longer a ghost. I was the curator of the Thorne legacy. Julian didn't think it was necessary to tell him, until today. I looked at my son, standing on the stairs he wanted to sell, and then at the woman who had struck me in the dark. The silence of the afternoon was gone, replaced by the heavy electric tension of a storm about to break. The abyss was over. The preparation was complete. Come in, Arthur, I said, a cold, calm smile touching my lips. Thomas, Sienna, sit down. I've made a very special dish, and I want to make sure you taste every single ingredient. The fog outside pressed against the windows, sealing us in. The house breathed, but this time it was a long, jagged exhale of a secret finally being set free. The abyss had been dark, but in that darkness I had found my sight. Dinner was served, and retribution was the main course. The dining room was a theatre of shadows and silver. The chandelier overhead cast a low amber glow that seemed to pool on the surface of the mahogany table, reflecting our faces like distorted portraits in a dark lake. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his presence as solid as a mountain. He didn't speak immediately. He simply sat there, his large, weathered hands resting on either side of his plate, watching Sienna and Thomas with a calm intensity that made the air in the room feel heavy. Thomas sat across from me, his head bowed, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. Sienna was next to him, her back straight as a spear, her face a mask of calculated politeness that was beginning to crack at the edges. I brought out the first course, a simple roasted marrow on sourdough, the kind Julian used to love. The smell of rich, savory fat and charred wood filled the room. I moved slowly, my hip aching with every step, but I kept my head high. I had reapplied the concealer, but I knew Arthur had seen the truth in the foyer. He was a man who lived in the details, a man who had spent 40 years his reading the lies written in the eyes of others. The Sterling Trust, Sienna said, her voice finally breaking the silence. She tried for a light, curious tone. but it came out tight and defensive. It's fascinating, Arthur. Thomas and I have been so diligent about organizing the estate, yet this never appeared in any of the primary filings. You must have kept it in a very specialized ledger. Arthur didn't look at her. He looked at Thomas. Your father was a man who understood the nature of storms, Thomas. He knew that houses don't just collapse from the outside. Sometimes the rot starts in the foundation. The Sterling Trust wasn't meant to be part of the primary filings. It was meant to be a life raft, only to be launched when the ship was being deliberately steered into the rocks. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes glassy and confused. Steered into the rocks? Arthur, what are you talking about? We're just trying to move Mum to a safer place. Bellevue is top tier. It costs $12,000 a month. We aren't trying to sink anything. We're trying to save her from herself. The audacity of his words felt like a cold draft in the room. I felt the bruise on my cheek throb, a sharp, rhythmic reminder of the safety they were providing. I picked up my wine glass, the crystal catching the light. $12,000 a month, I said softly. My voice sounded different to my own ears, clearer, more resonant. And how do you plan to pay for that, Thomas? With the equity from this house? The house your father promised would always be mine. Sienna leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. It's a logical transition, Martha. Assets should be liquid when they no longer serve their purpose. This house is a burden you can no longer carry. Thomas has the legal authority to make these decisions. Arthur, surely you understand the necessity of power of attorney in cases of cognitive decline. Arthur picked up his fork, his movements slow and deliberate. Cognitive decline. That's a heavy term, Sienna. It's often used by those who want to substitute their own will for another's. But here is the thing about the Sterling Trust. Julian didn't just leave money, he left conditions. One of those conditions is a dual gatekeeper clause. Thomas may have a signature, but that signature is worthless without the countersignature of the designated trustee. And that trustee is me. Sienna's face paled. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. She had spent months manipulating Thomas, whispering in his ear, convincing him that I was a problem to be solved and a bank to be emptied. She thought she had won. She thought the deed was as good as hers. And now she was finding out that the door she had been trying to kick down was made of reinforced steel. You? She whispered. But that's an antiquated arrangement. Thomas is the only son. He is the natural heir. The natural heir is the one who honors the legacy, Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble. Not the one who tries to dismantle it before the body is even cold. Thomas, Julian left specific instructions. This house cannot be sold, mortgaged, or transferred as long as your mother is alive, unless Arthur Sterling determines she is truly incapable. And I spent 3 hours this afternoon reviewing the medical records Sienna provided to the realtor. They were quite interesting, especially the signatures. Sienna stiffened. I saw her hand move under the table, likely clutching Thomas's arm. Those were professional evaluations, Arthur. You aren't a doctor. No, Arthur said, finally turning his gaze to her. It was a cold, predatory look. But I am a man who knows a forgery when he sees one. And I'm a man who knows that a librarian like Martha doesn't just forget how to pay the electric bill. She is systematically prevented from doing so. I've seen the logs, Thomas. I've seen the unauthorized access to her accounts. $85,000 moved into a shell account in the last 3 months. 85,000. Thomas turned to Sienna, his mouth falling open. 85? Sienna, you said it was only 5,000 for the deposit. You said we were just moving things for tax purposes. Sienna didn't flinch. She was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals are at their most dangerous. I was managing the future, Thomas. I was making sure we had enough for the long-term care. Do you have any idea how expensive those places are? I was protecting us. Protecting us, or yourself? I asked. I felt a surge of energy, a fragile but growing strength. You didn't just want my house, Sienna. You wanted my history. You wanted to erase me so you could fill this space with your own hollow ambition. I stood up and walked to the sideboard, bringing out the main course. The beef was tender, falling apart under the weight of the knife. I served Arthur first, then Thomas, and finally Sienna. I made sure to stand close to her, let her feel the heat of the plate. The Sterling Trust isn't just about the money, I said, returning to my seat. It's about the home. Julian knew that a house like this is a sanctuary. It's where the Thorn name means something, and tonight it's going to mean something again. Arthur took a bite of the beef, nodding slowly. Excellent, Martha. Just like Julian liked it. He looked back at Thomas. Thomas, you have a choice to make. You can continue down this path with your wife, and I will be forced to bring in a forensic audit that will likely lead to criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Or you can listen to what your mother has to say. You can start to remember who you were before you allowed your spine to be replaced by another woman's greed. Thomas was trembling now. He looked at the meat on his plate as if it were poison. Criminal charges? Arthur, she's my wife. I love her. Love doesn't require the destruction of your mother, Thomas, I said. My voice was gentle now, but it held the weight of a lifetime of lessons. Love is what I did for you for 35 years. Love is the dandelions and the stories and the nights I stayed awake making sure you were safe. What you have now, that's not love. That's a hostage situation. Sienna slammed her hand on the table. The crystal glasses jumped, ringing in the silence. Enough! This is a setup. You think you can intimidate me with your dusty old laws and your fake trusts? Thomas, we're leaving. We're going to a hotel and we're calling a real lawyer in the morning. One who isn't a fossil. She stood up, reaching for Thomas's arm. But for the first time in 3 years, Thomas didn't move. He stayed in his chair, his eyes fixed on Arthur. The signature, Thomas whispered, on the insurance policy. Sienna, you said you had the notary come while I was at work. You said it was all legal. It was, she shouted, her poise finally evaporating into a shrill, jagged panic. I was doing it for us. Arthur leaned back, his eyes cold and dark. A notary who just happened to be your cousin's best friend, Sienna. A notary whose license was suspended 2 years ago. We've been busy, Martha and I. We've been cataloguing the lies. I looked at my son, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the boy I used to know. The boy who valued the truth. The boy who used to hide behind my legs when he did something wrong. He was beginning to wake up, and the waking was a painful, ugly process. I saw her hit you, Thomas said, the words barely a breath. He looked at me then, his eyes filling with a sudden, violent clarity. This morning, I was in the hallway. I heard the slap. I saw you stumble, and I stayed in my room. I was so afraid of her. I was so afraid of the mess. The confession was a jagged glass in my heart. He had seen it. He had known. And he had chosen the abyss. But the fact that he was saying it now, that was the fragile anchor I needed. I know, Thomas, I said, my hand moving to the bruise on my cheek. I knew you were there. I felt your silence. But you're talking now, and that's the first step. Sienna looked at him with utter contempt. You coward. You pathetic, weak little man. I did everything for you. I made you someone. Without me, you're just a bored engineer in a rotting house. And with you, Thomas said, his voice gaining a sudden, surprising strength, I'm a criminal. I'm a man who let his wife hit his mother. Arthur stood up then, his charcoal coat making him look like a shadow that had finally taken form. Sienna, I think it's time for you to go. There is a bag packed for you in the hallway. Thomas has agreed to a temporary separation while the audit is conducted. If you try to contact Martha, or if you set foot on this property again before the legal proceedings are finalized, I will have you arrested for the assault I am currently documenting with my own eyes. You have no right, Sienna screamed. I'm his wife, and I'm the trustee of the Thorn legacy, Arthur replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. And I have more friends in the Seattle Police Department than you have lies in your head. Get out. I watched as Sienna's world collapsed. She looked at Thomas, searching for the weakness she had exploited for years, but she found only a cold, hard wall of shame. She looked at me, and I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, my fingers tracing the rim of the glass Julian had given me. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the dining room, her heels clicking a frantic, desperate rhythm on the hardwood. I heard the front door slam, a violent, final sound that seemed to make the whole house exhale. Silence returned to the dining room, but it was a clean silence. The metallic smell of her perfume was gone, replaced by the warm, honest scent of the dinner I had prepared. Thomas stayed in his chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Arthur walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, a firm, grounding touch. It's a long road back, Thomas, Arthur said softly. But you're home, and your mother is still here. I walked over to the head of the table, to the chair that had been empty for 5 years. I sat down, the wood solid and familiar under me. I looked at Arthur, my friend, my anchor. I looked at my son, my boy, who was finally starting to find his way out of the fog. The first steps were taken. The Kong-Li I sought was no longer a dream. It was a process. It was fragile, yes. It was built on the ruins of a marriage and the pain of a betrayal. But it was real. Eat your dinner, Thomas, I said, my voice steady and full of a quiet, unyielding power. We have a lot of work to do, and the morning will be here before you know it. The Seattle rain began to fall again, a soft, rhythmic patter on the roof. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. The house was breathing again, and this time, it was the sound of life returning to the Thorn legacy. Retribution was coming, but for tonight, there was only the truth, and a mother who had finally learned how to fight for herself. The morning after Sienna left felt like the first breath of air after being submerged in stagnant water for years. The Seattle rain had turned into a fine silver mist that hung over the garden, clinging to the rhododendrons Julian had planted when we were young and full of foolish hope. I stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where my face had been struck just 24 hours ago, and I watched the steam rise from my coffee. The bruise was no longer a secret hidden under concealer. It was a badge of honor now, a purple and yellow map of the territory I was reclaiming. Arthur was in the study with Thomas, the muffled sound of their voices drifting through the house like the low hum of a distant storm. The paper trail was long, a jagged line of greed that stretched back 3 years. And today, we were finally reaching the end of the line. I walked to the hallway and saw the boxes. Sienna's things. I had spent the early hours of the morning systematically removing her presence from my home. Her silk scarves that smelled of those metallic roses, her expensive shoes that had clicked like predatory claws on my hardwood floors. her vanity mirrors that only reflected a hollow ambition. I packed them with a cold, rhythmic efficiency. Every item I placed in a cardboard box felt like a splinter being pulled from my skin. I remembered the day she moved in, how she had looked at my antique furniture with a sneer, calling it clutter. She had tried to overwrite my history with her modern, soulless aesthetic, but she had forgotten that a house like this has deep roots. You cannot kill a tree by simply pruning the branches you don't like. Thomas came out of the study, his face ashen, his eyes rimmed with red. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by the truth. Arthur followed him, carrying a laptop and a thick folder bound by a heavy rubber band. The evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't just $85,000. As Arthur digged deeper into the diverted retirement funds and the forged signatures on the secondary mortgage applications, the number had climbed to $120,000. $120,000 of my blood and Julian's sweat, funneled into offshore accounts and designer handbags, while I was told we couldn't afford to fix the leak in the roof. "Mum," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands trembling at his sides. Arthur showed me the emails, the ones from the lawyer in Bellevue. She was already coordinating the move-in date for next week. She had even signed the waiver for the restricted ward, the ward for patients with advanced dementia. The restricted ward. The abyss had been deeper than I imagined. She hadn't just wanted me out of the house. She wanted me locked away in a place where my voice would be nothing more than a symptom of a disease. She wanted to erase my mind so she could own my property. "She told me you were wandering at night, Mom," Thomas said, a single tear tracking through the grey stubble on his cheek. "She said you were talking to Julian in the garden at 3 in the morning. She said you forgot who I was. And God help me, I wanted to believe her because it was easier than admitting I was losing you. It was easier than admitting I had married a monster." "I did talk to Julian, Thomas," I said, my voice steady and clear. I walked over to him and placed my hand on his chest, right over his heart. "But I talked to him because he was the only one in this house who still knew my name. I didn't forget you. You forgot yourself." Arthur cleared his throat, his expression grim. "The police are on their way, Martha. We've filed the official report for the assault and the financial fraud. Sienna is currently at a hotel downtown, but she won't be there for long. She's been trying to access the Sterling Trust accounts all morning, and every attempt is being logged by the fraud department. She's digging her own grave with every click of a mouse." The doorbell rang then, a sharp, intrusive sound that made Thomas flinch. I felt my heart skip a beat, but the fear didn't settle. It was replaced by a cold, sharp anticipation. I knew it was her. A woman like Sienna doesn't go quietly into the night. She comes back to reclaim what she thinks is hers. I opened the door. Sienna stood there, the Seattle fog swirling around her like a grey cape. She was dressed in a black trench coat, her hair perfectly styled despite the humidity, but her eyes were wild, flicking back and forth like a trapped animal. She tried to push past me, her shoulder hitting mine with a blunt force. "Get out of my way, Martha," she hissed. "I'm here for my jewelry and my files. You have no right to touch my property." "This is my house, Sienna," I said, stepping back just enough to let her see Arthur and Thomas standing in the hallway. "And you have no property here, only evidence." Sienna stopped, her gaze landing on Arthur. She saw the folder in his hand, the laptop on the table, and the cold, unyielding wall of my son's silence. For a moment her mask slipped, revealing the raw, jagged desperation underneath. She looked at Thomas, her lips trembling in a practiced pout. "Thomas, honey, tell this old man to leave. He's confusing you. He's poisoning your mind against me. We're a team, remember? We were going to have that life in Bellevue. No more drafts, no more stairs. Just us. Thomas didn't move. He didn't even blink. I saw the signature, Sienna. I saw the $120,000. And I saw the video from the kitchen camera, the one you forgot Julian installed 10 years ago for security. The silence that followed was a physical weight. Sienna's face transformed. The beauty drained out of it, leaving behind a sharp, ugly mask of fury. She realized the game was over. The theatre was dark, and the audience had seen the strings. "You think you've won?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the high ceilings of the foyer. She turned on me, her finger pointing at the bruise on my cheek. "You're an old, rotting relic in a museum of dust. You think anyone cares about your little trust? I'll sue you for everything. I'll tell the world you're a senile old woman who's holding her son hostage." "The world is already listening, Sienna," Arthur said, stepping forward. He held up his phone. "The police are outside, and the forensic accountant has already traced the transfers to your personal accounts. $120,000 is a felony in this state, a very serious one." Two officers appeared in the doorway, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the warm wood of my home. They moved with a quiet, professional gravity. I watched as they approached Sienna. I watched as her hands, the same hands that had struck me, were pulled behind her back. The sound of the handcuffs clicking was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of a period being placed at the end of a long, painful sentence. "Thomas, tell them. Tell them it's a mistake," Sienna shrieked as they led her toward the door. Thomas turned his back on her. He walked into the kitchen and sat at the table, his head in his hands. I followed her to the porch, standing in the mist as the blue lights of the patrol car began to flash against the grey Seattle sky. I watched her be pushed into the back seat. I watched the woman who tried to steal my life be driven away in the rain. When I walked back inside, the house felt lighter. The metallic scent of her rose perfume was finally beginning to fade. Arthur stood in the hallway, looking at the Victorian details he and Julian had admired so many years ago. "She's gone, Martha," he said softly. "She was never really here, Arthur," I replied. "She was just a shadow we let in." I went into the kitchen and sat across from my son. The special dish was still sitting on the sideboard, the beef cold now, the wine settled in the glasses. We didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the soft patter of the rain against the glass. "I have to leave, Mum," Thomas said finally, his voice a ghost of its former self. "I have to find a place. I have to figure out how I became a man who could let this happen." "You don't have to leave today, Thomas," I said. I reached across the table and took his hand. It was cold, but it was still my son's hand. "But you do have to help me. We have a lot of things to fix. The pipes, the drafts, and the trust. We have to make sure this house stays a Thorn house forever." "I don't deserve to stay here," he whispered. "No," I said, and the iron in my voice returned. "You don't. Not yet." But Julian believed in second chances. And I am a mother. We are the architects of second chances. We spent the rest of the day in a strange, solemn purge. We took the boxes of Sienna's things to the curb. We scrubbed the surfaces she had touched. We opened the windows to let the cool, damp Seattle air wash away the stagnant lies. Arthur stayed until the sun began to set, helping us organize the final legal documents. The purging wasn't just physical. It was a deep, spiritual cleansing of the Thorn legacy. As night fell, I stood in my garden, looking up at the lights of the house. It was glowing again, the warm amber light spilling out onto the wet grass. The bruise on my face was still there, a dark reminder of the price of my freedom. But the shame was gone. I had faced the predator, and I had won. I had saved my son from the abyss, even if the saving had left us both with scars. The purge was complete. The villains were in the dark, and the truth was in the light. I walked back inside and locked the door, not out of fear, but out of a new, unyielding sense of ownership. "Tonight, Thomas," I said as I entered the living room, "we won't talk about Bellevue, we won't talk about money, we're going to talk about your father. We're going to talk about the stories that built these walls." Thomas looked up and smiled. A small, fragile thing, but it was real. For the first time in 3 years, the shadow was gone. The purge was over. The confrontation had been won. But the healing, the true healing, was just beginning. I reached for a book on the shelf, the leather worn and familiar. It was time for a new story. The bruise on my cheek has finally faded into nothingness, leaving behind only the smooth, pale skin of a woman who has seen too much and said too little. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the Seattle mist presses against the Victorian glass of my bedroom, I can still feel the phantom heat of that slap. It is a ghost now, a spectral reminder of the day the foundation of my world cracked. I walked down the stairs today, my hand light on the banister, no longer gripping it for dear life. The house feels different. It no longer groans under the weight of secrets. It breathes with a long, steady rhythm, as if it too has been purged of a lingering sickness. I went into the kitchen and put on the kettle, the sound of the water beginning to whistle a familiar tune that no longer feels like a warning. The legal proceedings moved with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier. Arthur Sterling had been a titan throughout the winter, his charcoal coats a constant presence in the sterile hallways of the King County Courthouse. Sienna's trial was a surgical dissection of a predator's greed. I sat in the front row, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap, and I watched as the evidence I had meticulously catalogued was laid bare for the world to see. The forged signatures, the shell accounts, the medical records she had manipulated to create a narrative of my decline. It was all there, projected on a screen for a jury that looked at her with a mixture of horror and pity. Sienna didn't look like a leading lady anymore. She looked small, her sharp edges blunted by the reality of the four walls closing in on her. When the judge read the sentence, 6 years in a federal facility for fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse, the silence that followed was the most profound I had ever experienced. It was the silence of a story reaching its natural, just conclusion. Thomas was there too, sitting 3 rows behind me. He didn't testify, but his presence was a testament to his own slow, painful awakening. He had moved out a month after the arrest, taking a small apartment near the waterfront where he could hear the ferry horns at night. He said he needed the salt air to clear the smell of roses from his lungs. "We speak once a week now. It is a fragile bridge we are building, brick by painful brick. He comes over on Saturdays to help with the garden or to fix the things that Julian used to maintain. We don't talk about Bellevue anymore. We talk about the weather, the books I'm reading, and sometimes, very quietly, we talk about the father he is finally starting to remember without the distortion of another person's malice. He is a man who is learning to stand on his own feet again, even if his knees still shake under the weight of his own regret." I spent the spring reclaiming the rooms Sienna had colonized. I repainted the guest room a soft, buttery yellow, the color of the dandelions Thomas used to bring me. I stripped the modern, soulless wallpaper she had insisted on and found the original cedar underneath, still warm and fragrant after all these years. I donated her expensive clothes to a shelter for women who truly needed a new start, feeling a strange sense of irony as I folded the silk and cashmere. I kept nothing that belonged to her. To keep even a scarf would have been to keep a piece of the shadow. I wanted my house to be a vessel for light again. I wanted the Thorn legacy to be defined by what we saved, not what we lost. Arthur came over yesterday with a final stack of papers for the Sterling Trust. We sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the Olympic Mountains, turning the Sound into a sheet of liquid gold. He looked at me, his eyes crinkled with a warmth I had forgotten people could possess. "You did it, Martha," he said, his voice a low, appreciative rumble. Julian would have been proud. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, and he was a man who knew strength better than most. "I didn't feel strong, Arthur," I replied, the steam from my tea warming my face. "I felt like I was breaking. I felt like I was a book being torn apart, page by page. But you organized the fragments," he said, "and you wrote a better ending." A better ending. I thought about those words as the stars began to poke through the Seattle twilight. I am 68 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am truly free. I am no longer a wife waiting for a husband, or a mother waiting for a son to see her. I am Martha Thorne, a librarian of my own soul. I have survived the abyss, and I have found that the quiet of a long-lived life is not a void, but a sanctuary. I look at the house, my Victorian castle on the hill, and I see it for what it truly is, a witness. It witnessed the love I shared with Julian, the growth of my son, the betrayal of a predator, and the quiet, iron-willed resurrection of an old woman who refused to be erased. The garden is blooming now. The rhododendrons are a riot of pink and purple, and the rosemary I planted near the gate is thick and fragrant. Thomas was here this morning, weeding the beds. He didn't say much, but he left a single dandelion on the kitchen table before he went back to his apartment. I picked it up and held it for a long time, the yellow dust coating my fingers like gold. It was a small thing, a weed, really, but in this house, it was a symbol of a second chance. I know the road ahead is not without its shadows. The memory of the violence and the betrayal will always be a part of my story, a chapter I cannot unread. But I am the curator now. I decide which stories define me. I decide who sits at my table and whose voice echoes in my hallways. The silence of my home is no longer a cage. It is a canvas. I have my books, my garden, and a son who is finally finding his way back to the light. I have a house that breathes with me, and a history that has been protected by the very hands they tried to shackle. Tonight, I will sleep soundly. I will listen to the rain on the roof and the soft creak of the floorboards, and I will know that I am safe. I am home. And for a woman who has walked through the fire, that is the greatest victory of all. The legacy is intact. The Thorn name is restored. And the story, my story, is far from over. It is a profound realization that forgiveness is not a gift you give to those who broke you, but a sanctuary you build for your own spirit to rest. The trauma of betrayal leaves an invisible map on the soul, yet every scar is a testament to the strength required to survive the night. To find light after such profound darkness is not to forget the pain, but to integrate it into a narrative of triumph. We must learn to advocate for our own dignity, even when our voices tremble in the cold. True rebirth comes from the quiet courage of reclaiming one's home and one's heart, proving that even at the edge of winter, the seeds of a new beginning are waiting for the sun.